Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. As always, I'm here with Paul. And Paul, I was reminded as we take a look at the geopolitics of the Ukraine conflict and the demands by President Trump to bring about a ceasefire, I was sort of reminded of two other examples in history. One of those, of course, is going back to World War I, where the armistice and the ceasefire was being discussed, but at the same time, some of the biggest fighting and most deaths occurred in that interim while they were trying to haggle the parameters for the call for ceasefire. Then, of course, we have to take a look at the United States in the 1960s, late 60s, and early 70s in Vietnam, where every time, on four occasions, especially leading up to 1973 in Paris, every time the North Vietnamese called a ceasefire, the U.S. would immediately stop fighting, allowing the North Vietnamese to remobilize, rearm, and eventually by 1975, the U.S. was sitting there on the rooftops of the Saigon embassy, desperately trying to get out of Dodge. So, with this being said, it's kind of interesting how President Putin is dealing with this ceasefire. And from there, we'll go ahead and talk about the demands and expectations he has and how it's going to lead to the U.S. possibly helping Russia to fulfill the demands of their SMO.
Yeah, well, thanks obviously for joining me today as well, Ken. Always a pleasure. Yeah, this was one of these situations where we know effectively there was this mandate issued by the United States and said to the Ukrainians, look, you need to have an interim ceasefire. We'll then go, and effectively the feeling was they could twist the arm of the Russians. And as I said in a previous podcast on YouTube, there's three options. The Russians ignore it, which they weren't going to do. The Russians fully agree with it, which they weren't going to do. Or the third option is some sort of compromise. And it isn't even a compromise. A lot of the Western media were trying to sell this idea that Putin caved to Trump, and that, which is nonsense as well. He basically came back with a whole bunch of caveats, which we'll come on to, and in essence threw the ball back into the US's court. Although for me now it's more like a hand grenade with the pin pulled out, because it makes the position for the United States extremely difficult, because now they've come back and said, well, yes, we're interested in a ceasefire, of course, but it's not quite as simple as that, and you've got to start to take all these factors into consideration, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But on that basis, what does the US do now? Because effectively, we're back to the position which was supposed to be what happened. Look, there's going to be a peace agreement, you're going to have negotiations, and the war will continue until we reach a successful outcome. But it's interesting when you look at Kremlin aides, like Ushakov, who came out obviously yesterday and said, look, this 30-day ceasefire proposed by the US to pause the war would be an intention to give, Ukrainian forces some respite, and they're not going to be able to rearm properly in that period of time, but it might slow down the huge progress that Russia's making, because they've made huge advances in recent months and even in weeks. And and really it's on the basis that, well, if we stop that now, it might help to alleviate some of the problems with regards to Kiev and this very fragmented front line falling to pieces, and Russia making inroads into Dnipro, and effectively Ukraine being kicked out of Kursk. Now, of course, ironically, Kursk was one of the points that Putin made with regards to why a ceasefire is not that simple. But the Russian perspective also yesterday was, look, this idea of this ceasefire, it's all a bit too soon. We need to think out what this means, because it reflects only Ukraine's stance and position at this point in time, and we're not prepared to accept that. And of course, Witkoff arrived in Moscow yesterday to meet Putin. No indication yet what those discussions were, but Russian officials said that Waltz had provided details on this ceasefire plan on Wednesday, so immediately after the Riyadh meeting. And then Russia said, okay, well, we're in a position to discuss this. Now, Trump being Trump said he hoped the Kremlin would agree to this US proposal. And when, well, the Ukraine supported it, but so what? That's kind of irrelevant. But, the Russia's position's always been the same. We're not prepared to instigate a temporary ceasefire. We want a peace agreement that's permanent, long-lasting, and will remain in place for years, or hopefully forever to come. You can never say forever because who knows what happens the day after ever, but that's what their intentions are. Nothing's changed in that regard. And of course, the complication with regards to all this is okay, let's assume a ceasefire came into being. Who's going to police this? Because even the United States is not too sure about Europe's plans to send so-called peacekeepers to Ukraine, because they feel this could degenerate into some sort of military action. So, for example, let's say there was a ceasefire and there was these European peacekeepers, and then somehow some sort of false flag event happened, and accusations were that Russia was attacking NATO peacekeepers. What does that mean? I mean, that's really potentially very, very dangerous. And this is one of the points that quite rightly Putin has said, well, A, how do you police it? And B, who's going to be present? What are the ramifications of this? And, the Russians' perspective is we don't want any European peacekeepers there. I mean, Lavrov made this point at a meeting with the OSCE Secretary General a few days ago, saying this is very provocative. It won't resolve the conflict or anything else. And, and it might embolden the Ukrainians into imagining that there's some way out of this and they can somehow win still, because Zelensky, whether he means it or not, is coming out going, well, we want to be part of NATO and we want to be fully militarized in the future, even though I think Rutte came out today and said it's not happening. Ukraine is never basically going to be part of NATO. And interestingly, he even came out and said when the war's over, we need rapprochement with Russia. Well, there's no doubt this has come out the back of his conversations with Trump and Trump's officials, and absolutely right, that should be the way it is. So I think that, for me, is just a bit of an introduction. And I think, obviously, Ken, good for you to chip in. And then we'll go on to some of the more nuanced bits, as Putin referred to it, and why he just very intelligently threw the ball or the grenade back into Washington's palms.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I think you, at one point, either in our discussions or maybe even on an X, noted that what Putin has done by throwing it back is he is setting the trap. And I believe what you were trying to imply there was if the United States gets involved and makes assurances that Ukraine's not going to go ahead and rearm, despite the fact that after this they agreed to the ceasefire, Trump then allowed for military intelligence and a redistribution of weapons after he had done a freeze on that. So that right there sort of makes me wonder what the president is actually thinking about this. He's giving them the impetus. We want peace, but we're going to arm you for war, as if trying to scare Russia into, oh, okay, well, we'll have to make some decisions here. But the reality is that on the flip side, Russia, if the U.S. wants to make assurances, well, they can ensure all or many of the things that Russia wants when they started this SMO to begin with. The getting rid of the government, bringing about elections, protection along the borders, and as well as keeping them out of NATO. On the other side, though, is that Zelensky has proven to be cunning from the very beginning, and it wouldn't surprise me if he pushed the U.S. into a false sense of security while they do things like go after Crimea, uh, uh, start doing some drone attacks in the Donbass, things like that to spur Russia into making a bad decision or a choice. It's really fascinating because many times when things have looked like they were coming to a head and maybe peace in the past would have I think it was 2022. And of course that was scuttled by I think Boris Johnson. There was many opportunities for peace, but Zelensky decided to continue the conflicts as they go. So, when I think about the ceasefire in this respect, I don't trust the Ukrainian government in its current position, especially since they've pretty much made it an authoritarian. I don't want to say a full-out dictatorship, but it's authoritarian. Remove democracy from the government and the country itself, and the U.S. is going to walk in there and get caught in a morass that they're not prepared for. And what's Russia going to do then? Now they're going to be facing the potential of U.S. advisors in Ukraine while the Ukrainians are breaking the ceasefire. That's going to make things escalated to that fear of World War III that Trump continues to say he doesn't want.
Well, yeah, it's very problematic. So Putin came out and said, look, yeah, in principle, a ceasefire will be good, but there's all these nuances that require painstaking research, meaning, this is not a simple situation. And especially because Russian forces are making huge advancements. I mean, Trump comes out and goes, he put out a very promising statement. There's nothing promising about it. He basically threw it back into the US's court and went, well, okay, if we can have these nuances dealt with, which requires enormous amounts of research and understanding, then we might be in a position to have a ceasefire. But Russia knows it's not going to happen. The Americans know it's not going to happen. And Ukraine doesn't want a ceasefire on the basis of what Russia wants. And Russia doesn't want a ceasefire on the basis of what Ukraine wants. So, Trump can sit there and say, I want to talk to him or meet with Putin. But he said, and this is where Trump tripped up, because he goes, we have to get it over with fast. Why does all this have to happen so quickly? Well, the only reason logically is because Russia is about to overrun the entire country. And then there won't be any point for Russia to say we need an agreement. The argument then could be, well, we've won the war, Ukraine surrenders, and there's unconditionally, and then there isn't any need for this. So then it would make Trump look extremely weak, because he wouldn't have done anything to stop the war, because he's desperate to tell everyone, I stopped the war. And he thought, well, I can have a ceasefire. Both sides agree to it. Oh, look, I stopped the war. I told you I'd do what I did. Then he walks away, and then all chaos can ensue. And he goes, well, not my problem. I stopped the war now. He knows this isn't going to happen that way. He still wants to get it over with fast. But as Putin points out, there's a whole load of questions remain over all these proposals. Because again, it all has to be out long-term peace. And what happens after 30 days? Then the war starts again. And the basic bottom line is it has to deal with the fundamental issues, the nub of the whole problem, the critical aspects that Russia's always said: no NATO membership for Ukraine, no European peacekeepers in Ukraine, neutrality, demilitarization. And Moscow's given the United States a list of demands to end the war. And that includes recognition of Crimea and the 4 provinces or regions: Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. I mean, and it's absolutely clear that unless that and a whole bunch of other things to deal with, well, how do you implement this ceasefire? Who's going to police it? And as he said, what happens to the Ukrainian forces in Kursk? Well, are they allowed to leave? Do they have to stay? I mean, and what happens along the contact line or what's left of it? I mean, these are all very complex problems. Now, of course, the one thing Zelensky is quite clever at recognizing is that Putin was being very clever. I mean, and he is rejecting the ceasefire proposal, but not by saying I reject it, but by putting so many obstacles and legitimately in the way. There is no way that that ceasefire is ever going to happen. So Witkoff can go to Moscow and talk to Putin. And Witkoff's one of the few people in the Trump administration I actually think has some substance, and he actually knows what needs to be done. But what's he going to do? Say to Putin, well, you need to accept this. And he's going to go, yes, with 20 caveats, including all the original things we want to ensure that the war's over. But also, you're going to have to ensure that if we have a ceasefire and if Ukraine breaches those ceasefire, what? What do you do? Give them a smacked wrist or something? Or does the war carry on, or what happens? And of course, none of this detail's being discussed, because all the US did, in principle, was say to Ukraine, accept this ceasefire. And of course, Ukraine's going to go, well, yeah, because we're losing heavily on the battlefield. I mean, Kursk is practically on the verge of being totally liberated. So for the Ukrainians, a ceasefire for at least 30 days makes total sense. But you need to have a situation where, how do you have a mechanism to control the breaches of this ceasefire? What are those conditions? What does it include? What doesn't it include? I mean, and are you going to allow Ukraine to mobilize and rearm whilst this ceasefire is in place? Because they could start doing it 200 miles from the contact line. So the idea, you just put a ceasefire in. I mean, where's this agreement? Apart from the word interim ceasefire, where's the detail? No one's seen any detail because there isn't any detail. And therefore, even if you in principle agreed with it, you go, well, we need to see detail, and there needs to be negotiations to get a ceasefire in place. We're not just going to stop fighting and go, right, there's a ceasefire, because rightly, Russia's perspective is, well, we can't trust anyone. And we're not going to trust the Ukrainians. We're at war with them. Okay, the argument is Ukraine could equally rightly say, I don't trust the Russians. So you need to have something in place that is robust. But who's going to enforce this? The Americans don't want anything to do with this. They don't want to get caught in the middle of some huge geopolitical shitstorm, and there's no other word for it, because then they become part of the war directly. But they're going to become part of the war if this drags on, because Trump's talking about putting more sanctions on Russian energy, Russian banks, talking about rearming Ukraine, about financing them. I mean, he's basically allowing himself to become Biden and take over that responsibility. At the moment, he can wash his hands and go, this is all Biden's problem, but he looks like he's walking into a huge trap, and maybe not even a trap, but he's walking into a huge problem where he's digging himself a hole and he can't get out of it. I mean, and meanwhile, the war carries on, and if Russia kicks the Ukrainians out of Kursk in totality, which is on the verge of happening, which is another reason why they want this to happen immediately, that's a huge disaster for Zelensky. It's not a bargaining chip like the West tries to make out, because I think the Ukrainians now hold about 60 square kilometers of Kursk, nothing basically. So it is true, what happens to the situation of whoever's left there? I mean, they're stuck in this frozen conflict. Do they have to lay down their arms because there's a ceasefire? In which case, what do? Just stand there and go, well, there's a ceasefire. I mean, so what happens? Because no supplies can come into from Ukraine to support those forces, Ukrainian forces in Kiev, in Kursk, who have who aren't fighting anyway. So, this is the huge problem. And we highlighted this in our own podcast, but equally, Putin's just stating the obvious. But the Americans thinking it's as simple as going, let's call a ceasefire. That will force the Russians to agree. We can all stop the war. I'll look great. And then we'll worry about the detail later, because that doesn't matter, because the optics look like I stopped the war. Well, not only is he not stopped the war, but Trump is about to dig himself a gigantic hole if he's not careful. He could end up owning the war. And frankly, if things pan out as is likely to happen on the battlefield, this could be end up being Trump's demise. And in 2 years, he could be, or less, basically in 20 months, he could be a lame duck president who's lost the House, lost the Senate, lost any mandate. And that's what happens when you come out with statements like, I'm going to end the war in 24 hours. No, it's going to be 24 days, who knows, weeks. It's all open-ended. He wants it over fast because politically he has to do this, because if he doesn't, he knows he's in big trouble.
In many ways, I have some empathy for President Trump, because when he came into office, he is walking into a morass of U.S. geopolitical garbage that he didn't create, but he inherited. The what's going on in Syria, his talk of wanting to get back into Afghanistan to re-seize the Bagram compound, the South China Sea, the what's going on in the Middle East with Palestine. He's walked into all these things, and he's cashing checks that the great American hegemony empire can't cash anymore. And that's, I think, his biggest failure, and may end up being his final demise, is that he still thinks that the United States is this all-powerful military and police force and empire that can simply snap their fingers and resolve every problem on the earth. But the reality is that they're not going to be able to do anything, even once. So the thing that stood out to me, where he's getting himself into much, much more problems, is that every time that he proposes a potential solution, he then backtracks it with threats, i.e., well, we're going to cut off Russia from the dollar. Well, they're already cut off from SWIFT. I don't know if he even realized that. Or the contract to allow Russian energy into Eastern European countries like Hungary, that those sanctions, that the relief sanctions have expired, so he's going to make sure they don't get continued. Now he's pissing off a bunch of Eastern European countries that desperately needed that energy. Then, of course, the day of the ceasefire, Ukraine goes and sends in a big drone attack onto Russian soil, causing 4 people to die. I mean, it's like he throws this out there, and then he lets everything happen as if, oh, well, it's business as usual. Instead of, had he done that, told Zelensky, we're not going to give you intel, we're not going to give you arms, we're going to ensure that Russia knows this, we're going to, you're going to have to do new elections, and sell Russia that this isn't Minsk 2.0, and we're not going to go ahead and threaten you with all these things if you don't cede to our demands. But instead, he attempts to put more pressure on Russia, and Russia's just going to sit there and go, you know what? We're just going to keep doing what we're doing because you have no integrity at all or credibility in what you're trying to do. So I think when it comes to statesmanship, we talked about the times of the 1970s. At least then they had somebody like Kissinger. And Kissinger was able to get things done because he was extraordinarily pragmatic. In the case of Trump, he's throwing a million things at the wall. And if somebody goes against his wishes, then he just gets belligerent and makes threats. We see this in the tariff wars going back and forth, and we're seeing this in Ukraine. And it's unfortunate because he's dealing with somebody who is a real statesman in Putin, and we haven't even gotten to down the road when he has to deal directly with Xi Jinping. Trump can claim that he's has a friendly relationship along the lines, but this is an era where threats no longer work for the big players the way they worked for the Afghanistans, the Iraqs, the Libyas, etc.
No, absolutely not. And it's just the world's changed. It's not US hegemony anymore. And the US is weak. It's vulnerable. But Trump doesn't realize the world's massively changed since 2016. It's not the same as it was. The United States is not that country that it was even 8 years ago, and it was in decline at that point in time. So yeah, this is a huge problem. And to be honest, this ceasefire risks basically imploding his presidency. If this could play out in such a way, then in essence his presidency could, to all intents and purposes, be over. And it could be over very, very quickly, because if this turns out extremely badly for the United States, then his whole tenure is immediately called into question. He will lose the support, clearly, of those elements who were against him first time around. That is evaporated. He has a lot more license to do things now. But if this goes badly wrong, his support will diminish, and then he'll just end up like he was first time around, and then it's over. And people will abandon him very, very quickly, because we all know in politics, when someone becomes damaged goods, then very quickly, all the people who are cheerleading that person jump ship and will have nothing to do with him. And I'm not saying that's definitively going to happen, but he needs to be extremely careful and realize that you can't just come in after 3 years and everything that's gone on and end something that quickly and try to do it by thinking you can bully and browbeat the Russians into line, because he needs to understand one thing above anything else. Putin is not going to get away with that with the Russian people. After all this, and then he just rolls over and goes, yeah, okay, we'll do that. He risks the wrath of the Russian people, and he's far more frightened of that than he would ever be of upsetting the Americans, because frankly, his whole presidency has been about upsetting the Americans in one way or the other. So Trump needs to read the room better, and he needs to have people surrounding him who actually can say to him, you cannot do this. I know he's right to want to end the war, absolutely, but don't do it in a way where you feel as though you're going to leverage this like it's a business deal. You can play one off against the other. You can force the hand, and you can bully the Ukrainians. Well, he seems to have rolled over with the Ukrainians just to get them at some sort of negotiating table, because he couldn't go through the humiliation of what happened in the Oval Office again, where effectively it was just turned into this utter debacle. Basically, Zelensky was told to go home, leave Washington, we're not dealing with you. He couldn't have that kind of thing playing out again. So they had to just persuade them on some spurious grounds of a ceasefire with no proposals, no mandate, and thinking Russia would roll over. Well, it's not happened. So now what happens now? If they don't do this right, it could result in Trump being effectively a lamed up president.
I think there's one final point. There's a great example in history where one wrong move can shape the future for decades. And that, of course, is during the time of Khrushchev and Eisenhower. They were actually getting a détente. The ice was breaking during the Cold War. And they were going to have a summit in 1960. But Eisenhower had allowed the U-2 spy planes to do spy missions over the Soviet Union. And then when their pilot was shot down at the summit, when Khrushchev forced Eisenhower to answer for it, Eisenhower lied. And that quickly led a couple years later to the escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War lasting for another 30 years. So one threat and failed attempt of not having integrity can cause, unforeseen domino effects across the entire globe. And I think Trump is at that certain point where he can get a peace and resolution, but he's got to pick a side. He's either got to be on the side of Putin and Russia and end this conflict quickly, or if he tries to play both sides of the fence, he's going to be the one that has egg on his face. And as you rightly said, once he has a failure of that magnitude, his ability to then govern on everything else is going to be thrown out the window.
Yeah.
Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and for your great insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.